Hi and welcome to my true crime channel. If you like crime and you like psychology and you like them both together, then this is the channel for you. I release content every Wednesday and Sunday at the same time, so if you haven't subscribed, go on and do it now. I promise you it'll be worth it. Even if you've heard cases before, it's still worth listening to my take on it. I'm gonna say that obviously. Want you to come and visit my channel, but you get that little notification, don't you? So it'll remind you when new content is released. And I release it consistently. Today's crime that I'm going to be looking at is that of the murder of Angela Wrightson. Now, I've covered this in a few TV shows, but I wanted to do it the duty that I felt I hadn't been able to do it properly when I've been in an edit doing a documentary. It's one of those things when you're an expert or where you're presenting a show, you have to kind of stick to a particular kind of script and narrative, and obviously that didn't let me delve deeply into really what went on, in my opinion. This is known as the Snapchat killer's case. So before we talk about what led to this horrible murder, let's talk a little bit about how Angela Wrightson ended up living the life that she lived. So Angela Wrightson lived in Hartlepool, and I'm going to be honest with you, she had a really troubled life. If you look at the pictures of her, you can see it had been a challenging life. For her age, she looked considerably older. She's very fragile, and it was clear that she hadn't had an easy route. Very early on, really early on, she was estranged from her family, and she had 8 siblings, and all of those were brought up in the care system. I worked with young people in the care system for a very long time, and they are the most vulnerable. They are the most challenged. They are the least fortunate. Obviously, some children get really lucky. They get foster parents who are incredible and they get adopted. But that isn't the tale for many, many children. And even when you have a reasonable system like in the UK or the USA or Australia, the truth is that children are still at the end of the day closing their doors on an evening without a parent present. That's a really challenging experience to go through. We know that children who grow up in care often have attachment disorder, often have a massive abandonment issues, and it makes sense because their primary experience of attachment has been negative and their abandonment has been present and real. So she and her siblings were struggling from the get-go. One of the ways that she handled that was to drink. Lots of us self-medicate. Be honest with yourself. How often do you have a bad day, reach for a glass of wine or get some chocolate cake or buy some ice cream? We're all trying to get through life the best that we can, and sometimes we look for something to soothe. And when it comes down to it, alcohol is a type of self-medication. It anesthetizes feelings temporarily, and certainly if you've got so much pain in your world, then arguably you're going to be looking at something that can do that effectively. The fact that she starts early on, the fact that she's got a really chaotic experience from being a young child means that she really is starting behind that starting point that we want for children in life. She's already falling behind. She doesn't have those secure attachments. She's already got behaviours that we know are going to be long-term problematic unless they're dealt with early on. And she doesn't have a support structure, not the kind of support structure that is required. And she's in pain. There's so much pain. If you're a young person, you start drinking really heavily, you don't know how to manage your feelings and you're looking to have them managed. And sadly, if you don't have the people around you to help you manage them, alcohol works badly with really poor results in the long term, but as a temporary measure. And it's her escape, isn't it? Away from a tragic life. That drinking goes to the chronic phase. She becomes a chronic alcoholic, and often she's seen buying cigarettes and alcohol for local children. A lot of you understandably would judge that. I'm gonna be honest. I used to stand outside shops when I was a kid and ask them to do the same. I'd get an adult who just looked like they might engage with us and be like, can you go and get us some ciders? Can you go and get us some cigarettes? You know, these are the kind of things that a lot of us, be honest, some of you listening will be like, that was me. It was me outside the co-op. It's just the way that kids are. And if you can find that golden adult, you know, the kind of adult with low boundaries or high need, wanting to belong, then you've struck gold, haven't you? Because you've always got them available to then go and help you out when you need to hit the booze. And like I said, she's really vulnerable. She's really needy. She wants to belong. So she even got the nickname in a local neighbourhood, Alco Ange. So everybody knew One, about her problems, two, about her pain, so to speak, and most importantly, that she was a pushover. So that's not going to set her in good store with lots of the community, because we don't like children being given cigarettes and alcohol. But man, it's going to make her home popular, isn't it? She's going to be the place and space to go. She's going to be the knock on the door so you can go and get whatever it is you want to score. That is what she will be used for. And to put it in context, how much does Ange drink? Around 9 litres of strong cider a day. That is mind-blowing to me. To put that into context, I struggle to do what the NHS recommends and have 2 litres of water a day. I actually see that as a challenge, one that I regularly, in fact monumentally on a daily level, fail. Because I find 2 litres of water quite difficult to get down me. The idea of 9 litres of strong cider a day, how do you even survive it? We're indicative, aren't we, of a career drinker. Someone who has worked hard to build up that tolerance. But even when you have a high level tolerance for alcohol, 9 litres of strong cider a day is waiting for death. We're genuinely at that space. So it isn't unusual for Ange to be found lying completely unconscious in the middle of the road. That was the level. She would drink until she could drink no more. She would lose consciousness. She would be in the most vulnerable of scenarios. And that's the way that we have to look at this. Because if you're a human being who's in so much pain that you will put yourself at such ultimate risk that you're laying in the middle of the road, absolutely passed out, anything can happen to you. The level of low self-worth, the level of low self-esteem and confidence is truly astonishing. It really is. And that is a tragedy. It's a tragedy because she was failed. No child should grow up in a situation where they don't have a sense of connectedness. No child, irrespective of their beginnings, should not have a support strategy in place as a young person so that they feel that the village that it takes to raise the child is present. We use that term, it takes a village to raise a child, because it really does. It's one of the issues I've got at the moment. If you're watching this a few years down the line, at the moment we're dealing with a pandemic called COVID. You've probably heard of it, might have lived through it, probably will have. I don't know, maybe in 30 years you'll be watching this and you'll be like, what is she talking about? Whilst you use your computerized automatic scheduler to deliver your food in the house that you now rent, but you're happier than ever. Believe me, one day you'll get that. And if you don't, Google it in the future. You'll be like, does Google even exist? I don't know. Anyway, I digress. The point is that Ange is one of those people that we failed to some degree. Another thing that Ange was dealing with was the fact that she'd lost a partner, and she'd lost that partner to an alcohol-related illness. So she's got grief all the way through her life, hasn't she? I often feel like that psychologically. What is grief? You know, often we associate it with bereavement, and Ange had definitely lost to bereavement, but it isn't just bereavement. Grief is something that consumes us when we haven't had what we should have had. It can be a sense of longing, and it can indeed be a sense of physical loss, as in you lose a partner or a friend. But there is something more about Ange's experience of grief. She hasn't had what so many people deserve. Everybody deserves, in fact, to feel the love from a parent to a child. When you don't have that, the scars and wounds are so deep. So just acknowledging that. It's really easy with Ange to almost dismiss her because of the way that she invited certain chaos into her world. But we've always got to hold at the centre of this, that she was somebody who was truly unwell, and that was mainly because the world had happened to her. She had been affected by others' actions really early on. Just need that. It's like when I talk about prostitutes who are women and mothers and sisters and daughters and friends. You know, we often give labels and it makes it easier for us to manage the demise. We say it was their fault. They were inviting that situation. They made choices. It's really easy to do that because it makes us feel safe, doesn't it? If we can choose a different path, then we can feel that we have a more secure future. It doesn't work that way, and nobody deserves the kind of impact that people like Ange suffer. So just highlighting that, I always want to bring the victim into play. This was a human being that had intrinsic meaning to the world, even if she hadn't found what that meaning exactly was. One of the things that friends would say about Ange was that they think the trigger for a real downward spiral was when she lost a partner. That At that point, her house went from a space that was for her and the person that she loved to a real DOS house. Just the place where local youths would come, like a youth centre, and also a place where unsavoury characters would turn up. And remember, she's really vulnerable. She was somebody who was chaotic. She was somebody who at times got into situations where there was aggression involved, and she got into fights. She was involved in quite a lot of antisocial behaviour. She was even known for calling emergency services and actually suggesting that things were needing to be called out when they weren't. You would be surprised how common this is. Now, I'm going to break it down. Why would Ange choose to call emergency services? On one level, a hoax call is obviously something reprehensible. It means that people who are in trouble don't get the services they require. Okay, I'm going to shelve that for a minute. Then I'm going to bring it in a child who's grown up feeling potentially abandoned, not feeling validated, not having attention, and not having control. Making those hoax calls offers that opportunity, doesn't it? Just temporarily, to be in control of the world, to be important, to have attention. And even though it's counterproductive in the long term, you can see how that cycle would be. Also, if we haven't felt protected, well, what more makes you feel protected than calling the emergency services? What's that subtext? What's that unconscious drive wanting to call them to be noticed? So I do have sympathy and empathy because of her mindset, but obviously that is not acceptable behaviour. And it strikes me that we're dealing with something more than just an attention-seeking alcoholic. I think there's probably a subtext here on a mental illness level. Not that I can assess her, not that I know the answer to that. Now, whilst those behaviours are considered uncommon, we do actually see it when mental illness is present because people are trying to find a way of being noticed. She'd also been subject of a drinking ban, which meant that she basically couldn't buy alcohol in the local area. She ignored it. I mean, if it was that easy, right? I'm an alcoholic. You are banned from buying alcohol in your local area. I am cured. I don't get it either, but whatever. They banned her from the local shops. I get what they were trying to do. They were trying to protect her. But one, you're always going to find a shopkeeper who's like, it's okay, Ange. I need your money. And secondly, alcohol is a bus ride away. You're not going to be in a situation where you can't access it. Most importantly, have you ever thought that shopkeepers and shop assistants are like, I must remember this individual, they've got an ASBO. Who even knows that stuff? I'm sure that people in all of our areas have got these kind of things, but the reality is that you wouldn't be aware of it. So she gets alcohol all the time. Just to let you know, if you're living in another country, so an ASBO is something that's known as an antisocial behaviour order, and that means that you will have certain terms and conditions applied to your behaviour. It might be that you're known for graffitiing, it might be that you're a vandal that's local to the area, it might be that you have very loud parties, it might be that you've been a shoplifter. You can basically get banned from certain areas and certain behaviours. They were very popular in the UK in the 90s and the early 2000s. They've died down now, but it was a big deal. And they used to get pictures of young people onwards in the papers being like, Dan was ASBO'd for shoplifting. And for some reason, they thought that social shaming would make a big impact. It didn't. It didn't, because it didn't change any of the issues that were going on in the person's life. But, you know, when have the councils and government ever listened to people who would work in that area to go, maybe we should listen when they say these things won't work, because social shaming isn't something that raises self-esteem. Anyway, basically, that had happened. When Ange's post-mortem was looked at, there was so much going on. There was so much going on for her. So, first of all, she had brain damage. She'd had previous head trauma. That wasn't to do with the day that she was killed. That was prior. Remember what I said about fighting and drinking and all of these things. When we have issues with our prefrontal cortex, when we have frontal lobe damage, these are really big deals that can make us have problems with our impulse control. It can mean that we act in ways that can make us more vulnerable. And it can also mean, of course, that we can be a little bit more violent and we don't have the same levels of boundary. We can certainly say that Ange had problems with all of these areas that I'm just talking about. Also, this really upsets me when I think about it, because we're talking about somebody who clearly was very sad, right? She's self-harming. And the fact that there was evidence of self-harm means that they were present. It was happening at the time that she was murdered, and she was suffering clearly from that pain that she felt within her. That self-medication again, the drinking, the self-harming, the vulnerability. She also undoubtedly and understandably had the onset of cirrhosis of the liver. How could you not, drinking that much alcohol? And when they look back at Angela's criminal record, look, she had a really significant criminal record. She'd been in and out of prison. She had 47 criminal convictions. I want to highlight as well that when I work with young people in care, they would often walk into the care system without any criminal record. And within weeks, and I mean weeks, they were criminalised. Why? They'd smash a chair up in a fit of rage because they'd been abandoned during their care experience, and they'd get an instant criminal record for damage, for criminal damage. So a lot of those records can be applied to entering the foster system or entering the care system. It's not always about people becoming criminalised. Often the system criminalises them. I can't say that's the case for her, but I would bet you bottom dollar that it starts when she enters the care system. I would bet you bottom dollar that it's given to her partly by the care system. I'm not trying to be too negative about the care system. We do at least have one, but it's really hard. It's hard being a kid in there. You know, one of the things that's really tragic about Ange when you look at her history is that it seems like she felt more comfortable being inside prison than she did being out. She had an institutionalization, you know, she'd been within a system her whole life. You know what's happening, the rhythm of that experience. And it's like knowing that your food is served at this time, your purpose is to go and do that job, you'll be sleeping in this place, you won't be able to have access to alcohol. All of those kind of things would probably mean that she had a better experience inside than she did outside. And I always believe that people who keep returning to prison, it's very easy to say, well, they have a choice. But if your life is that bad, that challenging, that lonely, that being in prison is better than being out, that's a failure, isn't it, on society's part? No prison should be better than your home. No community should be better inside than outside. So if you are choosing prison over freedom, that's because you're in a really bad place. It's not because you're a bad person. It's because your life is so bad that being locked up 24/7 and having pretty much your rights stripped from you is nicer than being outside. Now, after being released from prison, it's 2011, that's the last time before her death, she moves from her hometown of Darlington to Hartlepool. This was her fresh start. She identified with this as a new beginning, to get away from an area that was holding her back, that had memories for her, that maybe the local community wouldn't allow her to move on from. I don't want you to believe that when I talk about Ange that she didn't have support opportunities around her. She did. She wasn't just left to struggle by herself. She hadn't completely been forgotten by the authorities. And even though she was quite an aggressive drunk who'd never even held down a job, they still believed that there was potential for change. You know, she received quite a lot of help from a local authority and from local authority agencies elsewhere. She was under the care of a social worker. Her rent was paid by the council, direct to her landlord, so she couldn't take that and drink it. So they were trying to create a support strategy around her. But sadly, time and time again, she just refused to engage with the services. And they could have helped her. They really could have. You know, that drinking habit could have been dealt with if she'd had the right kind of environment. On one occasion, I also want it noted, they found funding. So they'd actually managed to get her an opportunity to go to a retreat in York. And that was where she'd have been treated for her alcoholism. Now, those places are like gold dust. They're really expensive and they're not massively effective. That's not to say that the centres aren't great. What I'm saying is they're not massively effective because you still have choice. So imagine being a chronic alcoholic, getting this amazing gold key, being able to go to rehab, but not necessarily having the willpower to stick it out. They can't keep you there. You've got your opportunity to walk away. It took 24 hours. She was back home. She was drunk. So they didn't fail her as far as wanting to make sure that they were still trying to engage her, but you can't do that kind of rehab experience unless the person wants to do it. And Ange at this point didn't want to. I think She was probably living her life knowing that she wouldn't have a very long life. Maybe she hated the fact that other people were trying to control a life that felt so uncontrollable. So the consequence of that was that she just fought back and rebelled. I don't feel that she felt loved. When you don't feel loved, it's hard to find worth. When you don't find worth, it's hard to find reason. And when you don't have reason, you don't commit. So pretty quickly now with this new start, it goes wrong. Our home becomes quickly known as the place to go if you want to get pissed. Simple as that. It's where kids can go and drink, take drugs, have fun, basically use her home as an abode that they can enjoy their time with their mates. And they're not really concerned about her. It's not that she's the centre of it, it's that her home is a centre of opportunity. She's peripheral to this. They're not interested in her, they're interested in what they can get away with in her home. So her house is on Stephen Street, and let's say it's one of those kind of homes that is considered economically inactive. That means that the people who are there aren't employed and aren't seeking work. So basically it was a deprived, rundown area, not the kind of place that is conducive to the well-being of someone like Angela. According to evidence later submitted at a trial, right, all manner of characters would arrive at her house all hours of the day and night. And that would include people with names like Mad Molly and Cider Bill. Just the kind of characters that you want turning up at your home. So we've got Alky Ange, Mad Molly, and Cider Bill. It sounds like an interesting cartoon or a B-grade soap. But to get those kind of characters named, you know that they're going to be infamous in the area. So she's starting to pick up these waifs and strays, and because her life is full of chaos, she wouldn't even have people knocking on the door. They would just let themselves in. They would just wander in and out of her home. Now that says two things, doesn't it? One, deeply vulnerable. Secondly, totally inebriated, hence why they can just come and go. It shows you the kind of chaotic experience that's going on there every single day. I'm going to be honest, as much as I have total empathy for Angela, I think we all do listening to this, I don't want her as my neighbour. You wouldn't, would you? You don't want somebody as a next door neighbour who's constantly bringing the waifs and strays, who's constantly got a party going on, who's constantly violent. This is not somebody that you want, because to some degree you want to protect your own. And if there is somebody living near you who tends to bring danger into that scenario, you're going to defy it, aren't you? You're going to want to get rid of them ideally. But I also want to bring in part of Angela's character that probably very few people got to know. It's certainly something I didn't know when I was covering the cases on television. One of the traits that she had was she used to take chocolate bars and post them to the neighbours' letterboxes for the kids. I mean, she didn't have a lot. She really didn't. But she must have had this desire to just spread a little bit of magic with children. I imagine that when she was posting those chocolate bars, she was imagining how beautiful it would have been for her to receive one as a child. Because when you're deprived and poor, when you're abandoned and rejected, those little gifts are like miracles. So I imagine that when she was posting those chocolate bars through the door, she was posting them to a childhood Angela. She was posting them to herself. And it says that somewhere within her nature was this really sensitive, loving, compassionate person. The alcohol masked it. The violence denied it to some degree in the eyes of others. But the reality was that there was a really good heart. The fact that she opens her home to people, it's a good heart. Now, as I've said, very chaotic lifestyle, questionable visitors. She was still really house proud. Her house is immaculate. She'd keep her home really tidy. She didn't have a lot of possessions because, to be fair, a lot of people used to come in and come out. So if you've got a heroin problem, you're going to take whatever you can get, whether that's somebody else's table or not. So she was vulnerable and she was having things taken from her home. But the little bit that she did have, she tried to keep in order. Local youths would often steal things as well. And another problem that Angela had was that when she was poor, she would also get rid of some of her possessions because she needed to finance her drinking habit. 9 litres of cider is not a cheap habit to have every single day of the week. And I think the hardest bit is just knowing that she's so broken and lonely. She's got no close friends, just people who use her, or people who've got their own issues, so that it exacerbates her problems, it volumizes them, and she's got no contact whatsoever with her family. So because of this, she's really prime victim material. look at the list of vulnerabilities. She's alone, deeply vulnerable, incapacitated often. Her home is used by anybody and everybody, and she is somebody that anybody can essentially have access to in some of the most challenging of states. So if you're looking for a victim, she's got it written all over her. So let me take you to what was ultimately Angela's last day on earth. So it's the 8th of December 2014. On this day, Angela is visited by 2 teenage girls. Those teenage girls would later that day brutally murder her. And they wouldn't just kill her. Obviously, death is the ultimate. But the way that they killed her, remember, these are teenage girls, is a prolonged, vicious and sustained attack. It's horrific. What's made even worse is that Angela knows these girls. You know, they've been to a house on many occasions and they themselves had problems. So these were children, remember they're teenagers, they're children, who essentially elected to go to Angela's house. And it feels like they elected to do that for the sole purpose of doing her damage. They didn't have issues between them. There was no beef, so to speak, no conflict. This was about calculated opportunity. So there's a few things that I can't do on this video today, and that's because of the law. Because these girls were minors at the time, a decision was taken that they're not going to reveal who they are in the press. It's something I'm going to talk about later on. It doesn't always happen. That's why we know names like John Venables and Robert Thompson. It's also why we know names like Michael Hamer. It doesn't always follow that a young person will have their identity protected. But because of certain things in law, the decision was made that the names of these girls will never be released. So I'm going to refer to them at this moment in time as D and F, because that's what the court referred to them as. D committed this offence when she was 13 years old. 13. F was 14 years old. Now, experts who've profiled child killers maintain that their victims are often symbolic. I want you to think about that for a moment. So when they're going to harm their victim, there is often a symbolic identity with a hated figure in their life. That could be a neglectful parent, an abusive family friend, an alcoholic uncle who harmed you. In this case, let's say, for example, D and F had this internal rage, had this hatred in that moment at least, or during that period of time towards Angela, because of what she represented, because of the parallels that they had within their own lives, and also because of the parallels that they may have felt their future was going to represent. So not just the fact that Angela could have represented a neglectful parent, that these girls could have looked at her and felt that they saw a vision of the future, a vision that they didn't want to see. And that in itself caused this internal conflict and anger. So despite the fact that these are very young girls, both D and F are already at this moment in time very heavy drinkers. They are also very well known to the police, very well known. So let's get to the night of this gruesome killing. So like many youths in the area, D and F had called at Angela's home, basically to ask her to get some alcohol. And she did it. She duly did it. That's what Angela did. She was used by people. CCTV footage actually show Angela in the local off licence. Remember, she's not going to be able to buy alcohol. Wasn't a problem. People are meant to do things, but they don't go through with it. And obviously, at that point, she's happily sold alcohol. She hasn't got any obvious injuries at this moment in time. So she returns to her home around 7:30, and that's where D and F are waiting. We don't actually know exactly what happened after they met at Angela's house. What we do know about this night is that by 9 p.m, the girls are posting images on Snapchat, and you can see Angela in the background, and this time she's got visible injuries to her face. At some point during the evening, she gets savagely, and I mean savagely, murdered. These are children, these are kids. My children are older than these girls. And yet these two girls savagely, brutally assault, torture and kill Angela in her own home. She's a vulnerable adult. She's a victim of this incredibly sustained assault by two teenagers that she knows, that she welcomes into her home, that she buys alcohol for, that she provides for. Now, neither D nor F say that they can remember much about what happened on that evening. Both have been drinking, and F was also high on prescription drugs, which worries me. These are children, really. The behaviour, I know, doesn't express that, but these are children, and one of them is drunk, the other one is drunk and high on prescription drugs. What we do know from what we've seen, from the coroner's report, etc., and evidence that's gathered, is that throughout the course of that evening, and throughout this sustained, awful assault and death, the girls smoke, drink, they dance, they take selfies, which they basically post on Snapchat. And when they're doing that, Angela is dying in that room. She's injured and dying in that room. They're dancing, they're drinking, they're smoking. If the ambulances had been able to come, there is a likelihood that Angela would have been saved. In fact, around 11 p.m. that evening, two of her drinking companions call. Remember what I was saying before? Cider Bill, Mad Mary. Those kind of characters turn up at her house. They bang on her front door. And when no one answers, they open the door because it's always open, really. And even though they're looking around and like saying, what the hell has happened? There's just a scene of destruction. They don't do anything. They just assume it's one of those things. They probably don't want to be bothered with it. Maybe it's a burglary. Maybe Angela smashed the place up. But they don't take the impetus to look further. It's really sad because they leave not realising that her attackers are hiding in the house. And also that Angela's there. So at some point, D and F leave Angela's house. They go off to meet up with some mates, and their friends are saying to them, why have you got bloodstains on your clothes? So it's being noticed that these girls are looking dishevelled and are covered in blood. But it's not enough for them to admit the things that they've done. It's not the end of the night for those girls. They go back to Angela's at 2 a.m. in the morning and they carry on. They carry on attacking her for another 2 hours. That's when they finally leave, about 4 a.m. in the morning. We don't know at that point whether Angela is alive or dead. We'll never know. The only people who really know are Angela and those girls. Now, put yourself in those girls' position. How would you be feeling? You've just carried out this intensely brutal murder. You'd imagine that DNF would be in a suitable mood to that, wouldn't you? Somber, scared, worried, anxious? No. Really high spirits, great spirits they're in. Chillingly, it seems that the murder had done nothing but made them feel quite joyful. In fact, at this point, we know their carers have reported they're missing. If you are in care and you don't turn up at a certain point, it's what happens. The police are already looking for them. They're well known to the police. Why? Because DNF have this habit of whenever they're being out late and they want to go back to care, they just give the police a call. Yep, they call 999 and are like, taxi. That actually is reality. That's what they did often. They would call 999, they would ask them for a lift, and even when you listen to the 999 call, you can hear the girls laughing throughout the conversation. Even the emergency operator is saying, why are you laughing? Why are you laughing? I know they're high, I know they're drunk, but just imagine what savagery they've just distilled on somebody else. And even the operator is kind of unnerved at the way that they're acting. But add to that they've just beaten to death a defenceless woman in a sustained act, an attack that lasted 7 hours. That's really inhumane, of course. And also it says something about their inability to take responsibility. As noted, maybe they have just brutalised this individual because she reminds them of them or of somebody that they hate. Maybe it's the release of rage. Maybe it's the folie à deux, where there's two people just together in that moment, carry out the savagery because they're motivated by one another, they're driven by each other, who knows? What we do know is that one of the girls took a picture of the other one in the back of the police car as they're driven back to care, and they actually post that on Snapchat. So they are even collating their experience. They're taking some mementos. Those pictures remind them of what the event is. When they looked at Angela's body, she had over 100 injuries. 100 injuries. They were the result of being struck with a number of different objects. So there was an 18-inch piece of wood with screws driven into it. A television set, coffee table, printer, shovel, pretty much anything that they could grab to hand, they used to attack her with. 80 of the injuries were directly to her head. So imagine how beaten she was. And also the fact that they go for the head, it's a definite strike to kill, isn't it? It doesn't matter how old you are. From a very early age, you know that head injuries can cause pain and trauma. You know that the head is somewhere that we need to protect because of our brain. So as teenagers, they would be very well aware of the damage that they could bestow on somebody that way.
Hello, can you please?
Anyone just rang. When are you going to come and freezing?
Sorry, you what? Hello?
I've just reported myself missing. Leave me alone. I've just...
You've reported yourself missing?
I'm taking over.
Shouting in my ear, can you just, what are you...
Like, I've just rang to let the police know where me and my friend are at. Will you tell me how long we're going to be on freezing? So to do it's wrong for that.
There's no need to be swearing, ringing up and swearing and going on like that. What's your name?
Well, I'm cold.
What's your name? Right, and where are you? Sugget Street?
Yeah. Stephen Street.
Pardon? You're in Stephen Street?
Yeah.
What's so funny?
No, you're just a bit funny.
I'm not being funny.
Sure.
Right. So, listen, right, you're in Stephen Street. We'll get somebody along there as soon as we can, all right?
Yeah, but I'm a bit cold.
Right, okay.
Angela was only 39 when she lost her life. Now, I grant you, she looked considerably older, but remember what she was putting herself through. She's having huge amounts of cider every single day. She was living a really unhealthy lifestyle. She's incredibly underweight. She was an individual who spent most of her time making poor lifestyle choices. And unfortunately, the way that that represents on your face and your body is always huge. You just have to look at someone who's given up alcohol for a few months and you're like, why do you look so healthy? What is it about you now? You're not poisoning yourself. I don't have anything against gin or any alcohol. I think it's all very nice. Just saying, when you come off it, a lot of you will realise that you look less bloated and fresher, shall we say. So Angela was somebody who obviously wouldn't look that way, and she had lots of lines and she looked quite saggy, and that's down to the choices that she made about her life and how hard it was for her. When she was found, she was half naked. That always affronts me. There wasn't a sexual motive for this, as far as the court records show. But it's humiliation, isn't it? It's a humiliating experience to have your clothes removed. It's a helplessness, it's a powerlessness. And she's found by her landlord, John Megerson. So again, that final embarrassment that your landlord finds you half naked, beaten to death, it's humiliating and it's violating and it's provoking, isn't it? It provokes me. What were those girls thinking? What were they doing when they did that to her? He'd come round because they'd had a row, him and Angela, the day before. He was in a situation where obviously his main concern is Angela, her lifestyle choices, what's going on at the house, whether he's getting paid. But when he'd come round, they got into this altercation, and it seems that she'd wanted him to buy her alcohol. He'd said no because she's not meant to have it. She had got quite aggressive with him, I'm not going to lie, but again, you can see the frustration, desperation. When you're desperate, you'll do things that you wouldn't normally do. She wants alcohol, it's her drug, she needs it. To deal with those unmanageable feelings, that's what helps her manage them. So when she hasn't got that available to her, it's going to result in her at times feeling angry. And she ends up throwing her keys at him lots of times. He ultimately leaves with those keys, probably because he's like, I'm going to remove a weapon that can be used again. It also shows great compassion on one level. He could just throw her out, couldn't he? He can get another tenant. But he obviously senses her vulnerability. And you know that throwing the keys at him, there's a childishness about it, isn't there? I think that that's the way he would have perceived it, like a tantrum. And he's like, I'm going to remove these from you and I'll see you tomorrow. Imagine walking into that, you know, knowing that the last time that you'd spoken to her, she'd been wanting something from you and you denied her for the right reasons. And you're thinking to yourself, the what if moments, the what if moments. What if I'd stayed with her? What if I'd bought that alcohol? Would that have changed the circumstances of that evening? There were all those buts, whys, what fors. They are the things that conjure those questions. Could we have changed the way that fate played out? He also confirmed that when he left Angela, she was drunk, but she wasn't injured. And that's important because now we understand that there was no self-injury at that point. Remember, she was a harmer. So it was possible that she injured herself at times, but she wasn't in that moment. Important for court to have known about that. So obviously he walks in off the street just to return her keys. Imagine the horror. And when the paramedics actually arrive at Angela's house, they describe this scene as being one of complete and utter devastation. There's broken furniture, there's glass all over the front room where Angela's body lay, there's blood-stained objects everywhere. They had used everything and anything to batter her with. There were blood spatters and smeared handprints up the walls, on the ceiling. On the ceiling. You know, this is where a really brutal attack's taken place. And you have to ask yourself what was going on that there were handprints on the ceiling. What level of celebration were they having in that carnage? When they were dancing around covered in blood? Because that was happening whilst Angela's life ebbed from her broken body. That scene of absolute carnage demonstrated pretty much immediately to the paramedics before they even had to take a pulse that Angela was dead. They found her naked from the waist down and she'd been left essentially in her own blood on the couch, so it had seeped into the couch. Hundreds of visible injuries all over her body. And it was clear that even though she only weighed 6 stone at the time of her death, so really, really underweight. She was petite anyway, but I mean 6 stone is very, very unwell to some degree. You know, it's clear that she tried to defend herself. She'd had so many cuts, bruises, scars that were both on her hands and her arms, that those defence injuries showed that she put up a struggle, she put up a fight, she fought for her life. Now, among her injuries, and there were so many, her head had been slashed with broken glass. She had a mirror smashed into her face. That's chilling, isn't it? The imagery, a mirror being smashed into her face. Again, it conjures up the idea, are they destroying a reflection of their future? There's almost a metaphor there, isn't there? And a physical representation of trying to obliterate something that they see potentially for themselves down the line. It's also worth noting, remember these are teenagers, young teenagers, 13 and 14, but during the murder trial, some of the crime photographs were deemed by the judge as too distressing for the jury to see. Let that just gestate within you for a minute. Think about what judges put in front of jurors day in, day out. They are used to putting horribly mutilated bodies in front of jurors for them to make their decisions. Too distressing? What does that tell you about the injuries that Angela sustained? That they were too upsetting, too traumatic for jury members to actually experience. To me, it's breathtaking. The day after the attack on Angela, the day after Angela's murdered, both of the girls are acting really suspiciously. First of all, just to note, if you ever want to get away with murder, don't do this. They start taking a real interest in Angela's death. You know, they're talking to their friends about it, they're asking questions of their support workers, and they're also doing that investigation around, oh, you know, how many years to get for murder? Not the normal questions you'd expect to ask, particularly if it's somebody that you know. You know, you have lost somebody that was in your social circle, you tend to feel sad, you tend to be concerned about them, you might have questions, but more about who on earth has done this. You're not interested in the intrigue surrounding the death or the potential investigation and subsequent conviction of the murderer. So they're not acting as if they are worried about Angela, they're acting as if they're worried about potentially being found out. But also that excitement is very interesting, isn't it? Because there is an allure for them about finding out what's happening. They want to know whether they're outsmarting the police. They want to know whether they're going to get away with it. They're probably excited and scared in the same moment, but they can't help themselves. They want people to be aware that to some degree they have an association with this situation. So DNF are pretty much arrested immediately, genuinely. Doesn't take long at all. They stick out like a sore thumb. Instantly charged with Angela's murder because they've been posting things on Snapchat. Again, not the most bright of moves when you want to get away with murder. And we have to ask ourselves, don't we, were they expecting to? Were they expecting to get away with murder? No, because they'd taken pictures of her, they'd Snapchatted her. They probably weren't necessarily intending to murder her when they started out. It kind of went on and went down that path. But arguably, when they were doing those pictures and putting them on Snapchat from the police car, that's straight evidence, isn't it? So they're building a case against themselves. That demonstrates that there probably wasn't the level of premeditation. We have to be careful, don't we? Because we can arguably say, well, they went to Angela's. They went potentially armed to Angela's. There was a premeditation to do her harm. Definitely, definitely. Whether there was a premeditation to murder, that's not something that we'll absolutely be able to confirm or deny. There was absolutely loads of interest in this case. So much public outcry. There always is. If it's younger people, the public struggle. You guys struggle because you see children as innocent, naive, often with parents to them. We have expectations about the way that they act and respond. Our understanding is that whilst they're forming their consciousness, they tend to have a kindness about them. And yes, whilst young people can be cruel, they tend to have boundaries, particularly around brutality. So when the public hears about murders involving young girls or boys, it pricks our interest. It goes against nature to some degree, right? So lots of people want to know exactly what's happened, what's gone on in these girls' lives to have created these kind of actions and reactions. First up, when you bang to rights, say you're not. Both of the girls were like, didn't do it, did not murder her. Didn't, absolutely under no circumstances, wasn't probably there. That's the way that they kind of go. So the younger says, I didn't notice any of this happening. What? There was a murder? There was a murder? Was there a murder? There was a murder. Basically, I would have known, but I was on Facebook the whole time. I'm in Angela's house because they can find where I am, because I'm on Facebook, so they can figure out where that is. I'm there all the time whilst the whole place is being smashed up around me. But Mark Zuckerberg has developed such a site that I'm so intoxicated and endeared by this site that I have lost sense of all consciousness and I can't hear or see. I'm just completely transfixed by the screen. Now, I do believe that kids do get carried away with social media, but come on. Bear in mind the scene of devastation. Totally impossible to believe. The older girl, however, a bit more savvy. She's thinking, I think I Snapchatted. Might have taken a few pictures. Probably not going to get away with murder. So I'm going to be savvy. And she says, okay, I did kill Angela, but it wasn't murder. It was manslaughter. And the reason it was manslaughter is because there were grounds for me being diminished responsibly. So she went for grounds of diminished responsibility. So basically, she was not in her right mind when she carried out the killing. Sadly for the girls, obviously haven't watched enough CSI, because one of the things that we've developed amazingly in the last 20 years in particular is forensics. And they have things like DNA evidence bases. They obviously have issues around luminol where they can actually look at blood spatters. And indeed, in this case, they get a blood spatter expert who testifies that it's clear both girls have played a part in torturing and beating Angela to death. So as much as they're going for not guilty and diminished responsibility manslaughter, it's clear when they look at the forensic evidence, that this is a bloodbath of a scene, and it's one that deserves the right sentencing. The first trial was accompanied by a plethora of extreme and really disturbing comments posted on Facebook by members of the public. Really terrifying and disturbing comments. So because of that, they decided that they were going to restrict reporting. Basically, the way that they look at that is, it's causing such a public outrage that the girls won't necessarily get a fair trial. Now, I know that a lot of people will be like, well, they don't deserve it. But we have to treat everyone as innocent until proven guilty. In recent years, that's become more problematic. People are often tried in the press and not in the courts. It ruins people's lives, and they're actually not even guilty. So the public court, i.e. social media, has now become deeply problematic, and it biases cases. When there is a bias in a case, it can actually cause an issue with sentencing. So as much as people think it's great to go online and identify people and tell stories about those individuals, when that gets into the news, particularly when the media pick it up, you can literally be causing an issue where a case may collapse. And on top of that, public fury is dangerous at times. And that means that there is a level of protection that is expected towards prisoners, particularly young prisoners. So at this point, because of this public scrutiny, this absolute outrage, there is a decision made that the identity of the defendants could not be disclosed on account of their age. I have to say, as much as that was the case, people knew. They knew who they were. They knew on social media. So this starts to get really, really intense. And the problem with that, as I said, was because it was so intense, there was so much bias, that ultimately that jury was discharged. Discharged on the basis that D and F would not be offered a fair trial. So we're playing with Angela's justice here, aren't we? And often we don't think that. We react, we're angry, we feel that somebody's been treated terribly, we want to rage. But the wheels of justice roll forward with a certain momentum. You can't interrupt it. And if you do, there are consequences. And in this case, it meant that that whole trial, that whole jury had to be disbanded. So then we get to a second trial, Leeds Crown Court. D and F, they're convicted. And they're convicted of Angela's murder on the 6th of April 2016. They're sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years. So it's a fair old sentence. You know, that's their primary years as an adult, isn't it? That means that those girls will serve a minimum term of 15 years. That is their primary adult years, isn't it, really? You know, they're going to be going through their entire 20s in prison, and the likelihood is that they won't get out at the end of that. Now, after those girls were convicted, public interest blew up again, absolutely blew up again. And there was one Facebook post about DNF that showed their photograph and a message imploring others to share it before it gets removed. It's the power of social media. So that photograph was shown. And let me tell you, just to make it clear, whilst I know that anger exists, whilst I know that rage is righteous in these situations, we also have to remember that these are children. And I know that's hard, it's a bug to bear. Do I think children are as bad as adults when they murder? No. I think the crime is as bad. I think the consciousness between child, adolescent and adult is very different. It's okay to completely disagree with me. Do I think it's heinous? Do I think it's wrong? Do I think they deserve their sentences? Absolutely. But we must always remember that even though these children have committed evil, brutal acts, they are still forming. One thread alone contained the following comments that I'm going to read to you. They both want hanging. God, they make me feel so fucking angry. Evil witches. All in good time in jail. They'll know what's coming to them. They'll get fucked up, horrible cunts. They should be tortured like poor Angie was. Sick little rats gets me fuming. Hope I see them in the future, me. I wouldn't worry about sharing a photo, honey. because it'll get shared far and wide. Then what are they going to do? Prosecute everyone that shared it? I think people need to know who they are. Horrible bastards. I hope they get a good kicking in jail. Evil scum. Hope they get what they deserve when they reach the age to do a proper prison. I hope when they get inside, I hope someone gets to them and gives them a good fucking over, like what Angie done to her. They want skinning and leaving to rot. They should be tortured the same way she was. Enjoy prison, because as soon as you other inmates realise who you are, you're fucked. That's the nature of outrage. Because no one could defend Angela when she was alive, so people started to defend her when she was dead. I understand. I really understand that outrage, but I always want to be aware that they were younger people, not excusing them for 1 minute. I will say, after doing some research, Dee's behaviour has not been good. She's in prison, but she is not behaving herself. She's been involved with loads of violent incidents, assaults against staff, assaults against other residents. So we're not seeing a healing process occur, and we're not seeing a resolution to change, shall we say. So in December 2018, she's charged again in prison with violent offences against staff. Gonna be honest with you, doesn't come across like she's very remorseful. Doesn't seem to have made reparation and restoration for her actions. You know, there's definitely a sense within this that she is more comfortable with an institutionalised experience. Maybe the violence in prison, the violence against other offenders is to clearly build a reputation. She's going to be there a long time. We could say, well, that's psychopathic traits. Of course it is. She's murdered somebody. She's acted in criminal behaviour. She's been an individual who's caused great destruction in her life, and she's been incredibly violent while she's in prison. It could also be that she's incredibly savvy. She knows what she's done. She knows people know about it. What are you going to do? You're going to put your head down? You're going to get bullied? You're going to get beaten? You're going to get threatened? Or are you going to do that? Because if you've got to make a choice in those circumstances, you either own it, I guess, and give yourself an easier time by being more of a don in the prison, or you deal with the ramifications of being exposed as a killer of a vulnerable woman and dealing with the consequences of that. So her psychology may not be that she is just psychopathic or sociopathic. It could be that she's also deeply manipulative, and there's an element of narcissism within that. I can't say that that's the case. It's just me anecdotally looking at evidence and saying the possibilities. Could just be that she's growing into a very violent adult who knows that to get her own way, she's a bulldozer and goes through people if they don't give her what she wants. Either way, she's managing her behaviour pretty shamefully in the institution that she's in. Once DNF actually turned 18, there was an application that was made by the Press Association because they wanted to revoke the anonymity. They felt that even though they had imposed it under the Children and Young Persons Act in 1933, they felt that there was licence enough now to let us know in the public who those girls actually were. So when this case came to court, the court had to consider whether continued anonymity under Venables' jurisdiction could apply. That means D and F's identity would never be revealed to the public. I'm sure that the name Venables is one in which you are familiar. So the term Venables' jurisdiction derives from the tragic case of Jamie Bulger, of course, abducted, tortured and murdered by two 10-year-old boys. That's Robert Thompson, John Venables in 1993. God, do I remember that? Absolutely remember that. It was horrific. There was a huge media circus. It was enormous, and it surrounded the case. It surrounded the identity of the child killers. So the reason for this is because of the risk of harm that's posed to Thompson and Venables from members of the public following the release from prison, they were given new identities, anonymity for the rest of their lives. So because of the risk of harm, which you can imagine, right? We let Thompson and Venables out of prison. There are a lot of people who don't want them walking the streets. There are a lot of people who would like harm to happen to them. So the reason that they were given those new identities was because there was a strong possibility that without them, they would come to great harm. D and F, they now sought the same anonymity. It's a really difficult one, I think, this, because ultimately it involves a balancing act. So on one hand, You've got the convicted murderer's rights to anonymity due to a risk of death or serious harm should their identity be disclosed, right? And on the other, you have the principle of open justice. That means that people convicted of crimes in open court should be publicly identified. Now, the Press Association, who were after their blood with respect, they argued it was not an exceptional case and that the granting of the anonymity injunctions would substantially erode the principles of open justice. They felt that the arguments in favour of continuing anonymity focused on the vulnerability of DNF. Now, the arguments in favour of continuing anonymity focused on the vulnerability of DNF. So what they said was that F was diagnosed with an emotionally unstable personality disorder, antisocial traits characterised by recurrent suicidal behaviours, instability of mood and short-lived stress-related paranoid thinking, and psychotic, which is hallucinatory experiences. D was assessed and described as being in a state of arrested development, so still replicating the same behaviour patterns that she engaged in as a younger child, so an immaturity. She had non-compliance, defiance, aggression, violence, and was considered very poor at emotional management. She actually presented as psychosocially immature for her age, and when they looked at her resiliency profile, it was one that you would often see in younger people with clinical issues such as depression, anxiety, and conduct disorders. When they also looked into their histories, they noted that both of the girls had self-harming and suicidal thoughts, and F had actually attempted suicide in the past. So psychologists had a job to do there because they expressed concern that if we did get to know who those girls were, it could be really psychologically damaging, and actually it could increase their risk behaviour. So it could increase their risk of self-harm or suicide. And I know that some people will be like, well, it's on their heads, so be it. But when you go into the prison or care system, the burden of care is in those who run it. So it is actually the duty and diligence of the organisation looking after those individuals to ensure that they are safe, even if people don't believe that they deserve that safety. And they are high risk behaviours there. And as I've said, normally cases like this arise because what they're worried about is others harming those individual offenders. I'll tell you why this is a unique case. Right, this is a unique case because they were looking at applying Venables jurisdiction because the risk of death or possible harm was actually coming from DNF themselves. So it wasn't that the psychologists were worried that DNF may be harmed by others. It was using Venables' case to argue that DNF were a risk themselves. And they felt that that therefore granted them the opportunity to use that jurisdiction. Okay, so go with me, guys. This is how the law plays out. In order for Venables' jurisdiction to apply and to protect a person's Article 2 and Article 3 rights under the European Convention of Human Rights, which is basically the right to life and prohibition of torture and inhuman or degrading treatment of punishment, respectively, it had to be proved that the offender was a person suffering from mental disorder, in state custody because of a crime committed as a child, and at risk of self-harm or suicide, which would be materially increased by the consequences of revealing their identity. Now, if this can be proven, the court would not take press's right to freedom of expression under Article 10 into account, no matter how substantial they were. So no matter how brilliant their arguments were that those girls needed to have their identity revealed, it would not matter how powerful the arguments were. They would never get their anonymity lifted. It was a big fight. It really was. So ultimately, the court went ahead. They granted a permanent injunction against revealing DNF's identities on the basis of a serious risk of harm, but not from other people, from the convicted murderers themselves. So should their identity ever be revealed, they believed that they may kill themselves or harm themselves. Interesting way of using that legislation, that jurisdiction, isn't it? Because really, it was meant to be and was created to be a protection for prisoners who were released into the communities and might get murdered. It wasn't about somebody risking their own lives by harming themselves. But they managed to argue that case. Because of that, we'll never know. We will never know the true identity of those two girls who brutally murdered Angela Wrightson. What do you think of that? Is that the correct decision? That they get to murder and brutally kill somebody, go to prison, act diabolically potentially, get released, get a completely new identity, cost of you, the taxpayer, walk away, no one ever knowing what they did, no way of finding out. Might be living next door to you, who knows? Might be going out with one of your sons in the future, one of your daughters. That's what happens with these kind of jurisdiction decisions. What's really surprising about this case is that the two young killers on the surface seemed like pretty normal teenagers. Yeah, I mean, they'd get into mischief, stay out late, drinking, smoking, hanging around on the street. But, you know, it's what we did when we were teenagers. It's what I did. I mean, when you're a teenager and you can get out, you're in that awkward age before you can go to the pub, legally at least. Stay out drinking, smoking, hanging around. But that was kind of normal behaviour, right? There was nothing in their history, nothing that stood out really, that demonstrated there was a potential for violent behaviour. That is unusual. They got to 13 and 14 and yeah, they were in the care system and yeah, they'd had issues and yeah, they were drinking. Yes, some of them were taking drugs. But actually when it came down to violence and predisposition of their nature, that hadn't really unfurled. Neither were they under the radar. They were involved in the services. The girls had known each other for years, both under the care of the local authority, both had support workers and foster carers, and whilst they weren't in mainstream education, they were attending an educational PRU, so they were having an educational experience. They had only known each other a few months, just a few months. If they hadn't met, if those sliding doors moments hadn't have occurred, I doubt they would have ever carried out that crime. I'm not saying that they wouldn't have gone down negative roads. I think they both had predispositions for that. But a few months before that murder, you know, could that meeting have been the catalyst? You know, what was it? Ask yourself, what was it that led those two girls to go from underage drinking to torturing to murdering a vulnerable woman in her own home? Now, during the trial, it's actually established that neither girl had planned to murder someone that day. What happened? What changed? And as I said, when you look at the attack, it may not have been premeditated. It was prolonged though. So whilst you can argue that they didn't turn up definitely wanting to kill Angela, when an attack is prolonged, we know it's not a sudden loss of control. It's not a crime of passion. It's not killing in a violent rage. Still inexcusable, but much more understandable. It kind of feels like the girls even took some breaks during the course of that attack. We see them drinking, smoking, selecting items that they're going to use to batter Angela. And what's even more chilling is they took 2 hours out to meet their mates before returning to continue the attack. They were able to switch off from brutally assaulting somebody and then switch on to socialising and then switch back on to brutalising. Could you have done that? Both girls, I'm going to be honest, when you look at their past, they had suffered physical abuse and to some extent their biological parents had been problematic. So they'd had a hard time, like Angela had. So we look at that pattern and we say to ourselves, well, when you're treated very badly, when your own biological parents are physically abusive to you, the people who are meant to love you and care for you, how do you manage that? Of course, massive attachment issues, abandonment issues, also an internalised rage at times. We know that these girls also had problems with their own self-harm. So they were not happy. They were definitely young people who were struggling, suffering even. But that doesn't give you license to attack and kill an innocent woman. When you look at the younger girl's life in particular, she'd had a fairly stable upbringing. She went into the foster care system following some pretty serious rows with her mother. She would also go missing, so that caused the local authority to be concerned about her welfare. What happened with her was respite care had been arranged, but that respite turned into full time. But in spite of that, she was always in contact with her birth parents, and to all intents and purposes, she was described by school as a bright girl. So in contrast to her, girl F did have a more chaotic upbringing. She was in various foster homes, so lots of chaos. She had 5 sisters, and each of those 5 sisters had a different dad. Not judging a woman for having different fathers of kids, just saying that there is dysfunction there, and there is transience there, and there is an introduction of different men there, which is problematic for girls and boys growing up. And 3 of the fathers of those children were also in prison. So we can see that the kind of people around this girl were probably not the best influences on her life. Also, one of F's sisters was in prison for a really serious attack on her own mother. Violence was seen as an ordinary everyday experience for F and her family. So we can assume that F was somebody who had witnessed violence very early on. And that would cause her pain, and that would cause her a likely anger to the world around her. As a child, she was also referred very often to A&E because she had quite a few injuries, and those injuries were inflicted by her mother. Also, we should note that her mother had some quite severe psychiatric illnesses, and she'd been sectioned under the Mental Health Act. So we can psychologically say to ourselves, could it be that that caused her to trivialise violence? You know, could that have been her thinking that this is an everyday occurrence, it's something that she's been through? So child F just acknowledges that this is part of everyday life. Getting beaten up, beating people up, no big deal. Could it have been that she wanted to reject her birth mother? She's angry with her, angry with all the pain that she'd caused her, angry with the fact that she hadn't given her the attention that she deserved because she was always with these different men, angry because she didn't make her safe. All of those could have contributed towards the horrific attack on Angela. And certainly, we do have to give some burden to the parenting. We always do. We create our children just as much as they are born. We have a duty to them to provide a safe and loving environment. And if we fail them, there will be consequences. The burden does not entirely lie with the parents, though. A growing, developing young person still knows right from wrong. Her mum also used to give her alcohol and prescription drugs as a kid. Imagine what that could do to a developing brain, and also imagine the message it's giving you. What message is that giving you if your mother's handing you alcohol and drugs? It says that you don't care. It says that you'll do anything for a quiet life. It says that you've got poor boundaries. It says that you're not a protector. Kids want a protector. We all want a protector. So F's being failed. And also it was brought up in court that whilst F did look much more petite than the other girl, she looked younger as well. She was certainly the one in charge. She was the one who was driving, so to speak. And most notably, F was assessed and confirmed to have a very, very low IQ, between 60 and 70. So she was described as very childlike in the way that she acted. In fact, F couldn't even tell the court when her birthday was. And when she was questioned about killing someone, she actually said that the only way that you could kill somebody was to stab them in the heart, shoot them in the head, or they could die due to cancer. Does that give us an insight into the fact that when they were hitting her on the head, she didn't believe that that was going to be able to be something that would murder her? So yes, she's beating Angela, but she's not going to be able to kill her. And one of her support workers actually said she was one of the most volatile children that they'd ever worked with. And the self-harm that she inflicted on herself was incredibly serious. There are different grades of self-harm, and this was a really serious self-harm grade. They used to try to help her manage her anger issues, and one of the ways that they did that was to get her to draw pictures, a way to channel her emotions, so to speak. And when the police searched her room, they found some really disturbing pictures that she'd drawn a few weeks before. They basically depicted a woman stabbing a man in the chest. Should alarm bells have been ringing? I don't know. I think a lot of children and young people write, draw, describe things that they wouldn't necessarily do. I remember writing lots of dramatic letters when I was a child, telling them why I was going to leave home or why I wasn't going to be here anymore. It was an expression of self. It was a dealing with unmanageable feelings in a way that I felt fitted. If somebody had acted on those, my life might have been very different, but people understood that it was more drama than reality. But I guess if you're in care, you've got serious self-harm issues, and you are drawing these pictures depicting harm to another human being, and you're incredibly volatile, arguably it probably should have been brought to somebody's attention. Who knows? Maybe it was. Another really interesting aspect to this case is the fact that neither girl were concerned about getting caught. So this was not well planned. They left the door unlocked during the attack. They wandered the streets literally covered in blood, posted loads of selfies on social media from the scene of the murder, putting them there. So what can we say about that? There's either a clear ambivalence, right, about the consequences of their actions, or there is absolutely zero thought given to them. I think it's both. But either way, it suggests that their understanding of right and wrong was seriously skewed. Because if you know what you're doing is wrong, and you recognise that what you're doing could cause you harm, you're going to try to have at least the sense of manipulation required to try to cover your tracks. They were just like inviting everyone into that scene, weren't they? So this is not a sophisticated crime. Not that we would expect children of this age to carry out a sophisticated crime, but certainly it gives you an insight into the chaos. When the evidence came to trial and they were looking at who was the most dominant during the actual crime, they suggested that girl D was. Because when the trial took place, it seems that Dee was the one who orchestrated it. So she instructed the older girl how to attack Angela. She was smoking cigarettes, directing her to do what was happening next, chatting on the phone to friends. And allegedly, and this is only allegedly, let's remember, there was only two of them there, but allegedly, she repeatedly told the older girl to kick her head in and to kill her. It's pretty definite, isn't it? Kick her head in and kill her. It's also telling that the younger girl continually tried to blame her friend during the trial. In fact, she was constantly saying, listen, she hit Angela with coffee, she threatened her with a knife, it was all her, it wasn't anything to do with me. So very capable of just being disloyal and throwing everything at her friend. I get it. So many kids are like that, aren't they? It wasn't me. It's the classic. It was not me. I was on Facebook. Forever. It's such a contrast, that crime, that horrible, heinous crime that you'd expect an adult, malicious killer to carry out, and yet suddenly they're snapping back into being kids, trying to blame each other, pretending they're on Facebook. It demonstrates the immaturity. And even though the younger of the two showed incredible disloyalty to her friend, the older one didn't. She withstood the loyalty. She actually sent a note to the younger child in the secure unit, got intercepted, but she wrote in it, keep your chin up and think about all the fun we'll have when we're released. Shows you, doesn't it? There was something about the connection that she had with the younger girl that was really important to her. Maybe it's because she hadn't had those close connections in the way that she'd felt for that girl before. But she wasn't thinking about what they were about to face regarding their sentence or the years they were going to lose. She was concerned about them maintaining their friendship, caring for her friend's feelings, and making sure that she knew that she would be there once she was released. So for her, it wasn't the end of their story. For her, that relationship was something that was going to be temporarily impeded, to be picked up all the years down the line, or however long they had to serve. Again, it shows that immaturity, doesn't it? Yes, loyalty takes a certain connection, a certain empathy, but it's more that we are just two friends. This thing has happened to us. We'll be able to pick up where we left off. Just chill and don't worry about it. All the while missing that indelibly powerful link to the reason that they're there, which is the brutal death and murder of an innocent, vulnerable 39-year-old woman who died in a way that no one could have anticipated, and certainly not in a way that Angela deserved. These are always the most chilling, aren't they? We grow our babes, we want them to be wonderful, beautiful members of our society. We imagine them surrounded by other children as they're growing, believing that they can trust those that surround them. And yet, in every community, in every society, from the upper classes to the underclasses, but ultimately, now and again, these wolves in lamb's disguises are born and brought in to the very places that we believe are safe. Our schools, our parks, our homes, our lives. And for F&D, they still get to live theirs, albeit with an impasse. But one day, on a street near you, in a house near you, in your home, you could be serving one of them a cup of tea. And you'd never know, because they have a whole new identity. Venables jurisdiction. Sleep easy, guys. Hope you found this one interesting. I wanted to explain in detail why you'll never get to know who these girls are. I wanted to explain what the law is set up for in the UK in this case, give it a bit more interest. I hope it's educated you a little bit. I know that you know loads about crime, and I have this constant desire to want to educate you a little bit more so that you come away thinking, oh, I didn't know that. I bet half of you have written in the comments though that you did know that. And if you have and you did, knock yourself out and tell me something that I don't know. I will see you next time. Remember that I release content twice a week on a Wednesday and a Sunday. If you haven't subscribed, please do, because there'll be more coming from me on cases just like this. And remember, leave me your recommendations. I steal them constantly.